We're here with Jessyn Farrell, 2021 Seattle mayoral candidate. Jessyn, how are you doing this morning?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining with us. What I'd like to start a little bit before we get into our questions. What is it that has you running for mayor in 2021 for Seattle?
This is a really hard time for folks, whether it is, the economic disruption from the COVID-19 pandemic, racial injustice. If you're a parent like me, struggles with remote learning and lack of childcare. And I really think that there's this sense that we can be doing so much better as a city, that we're not tackling both the really basic things like basic service delivery, let alone the biggest problems like homelessness and climate change and housing affordability and public safety. I really think that there's this hunger for problem-solving leader who's really willing to articulate a vision, wake up every day and implement that vision. And I am hoping to make that case to the city why I am that person.
Seattle is facing an ongoing crisis related to unhomed peoples. Washington State experienced a 6.2 increase in homelessness in 2019-2020. King County spends over $1 billion a year between public and private investment to support approximately 12,500 unhomed people with disappointing results. If you were elected as mayor, how would you address this crisis? And how do you think your plan provides aid in resolving this crisis, both in a short term and in a long term?
Okay, well, I think there are really three parts to that question. Number one, what is the plan? Number two, why I'm the person that can get it done. And number three, what we need to be doing above and beyond that. So I'm going to kind of take each of those things in turn. And the broad context is we've been in a homelessness crisis now for many years, and our leaders have not really acted like that's the case, waking up with a sense of purpose and determination and holding ourselves accountable to really helping people get inside and get the services that they need. So I, like many, many Seattleites and people across the region, are just really disappointed in the lack of progress that we've made. Now, the good news is I actually think there's quite a bit of consensus around what it is that we need to do. We need to be creating more interim housing options. In COVID, we have learned that using hotels as a safe and stable place for people to come inside is really effective. We also know that we need to massively scale up access to mental and behavioral health services that people need. We have an opioid crisis in the state. We have a really strong state opioid prevention plan. We need to be partnering with the state to be delivering on that. And then finally, of course, not only are we needing to invest in the interim solutions, but we need to be such as interim housing like hotels and tiny homes and the behavioral health services. But we actually need to be scaling up our access to affordable housing generally. There is absolutely a crisis across the region, and that's something we need to be solving for. My background is as an advocate on transit and transportation. I am a former state legislator, and I've really delivered on those big regional solutions. And to get in front of the homelessness crisis, we're going to have to stop patting ourselves on the back for incrementalism and really relentlessly on focus on those particular solutions that are scaled to helping people get inside.
How does your plan differ, and how does this get us to the long term?
Well, the interesting thing is I actually think there's a lot of consensus. And if you look across the candidates' plans, particularly on those interim solutions, there is a lot of consensus. But I'm going to make the case that there are really two core differences for me. Number one, part of my plan includes massively scaling up affordable housing. I'm calling it ST3 for housing, and it takes its basis from the way we've really been able to scale up regional transit infrastructure. We have a regional approach. We're working together across 3 counties. We have a very significant public investment that is tied to a plan. And we're using, multimodal strategies to get people around. Similarly, in housing, we need to be scaling up housing at all income levels, very low income, all the way up through middle class housing, and at a variety of life cycle needs. If you're a family, you have a different need than if you're aging in place or if you're a younger person. And finally, every single neighborhood across the region needs to be taking on its share of affordable housing. So that's a core difference. And then, of course, the second core difference is, again, one of experience. I'm the candidate in this race that has accomplished large-scale regional and state solutions to our problems. I mentioned working on sound transit and advocating for transit, but that also includes having helped negotiate paid family leave and delivered the 2015 transportation package. So it's that combination of being able to deliver both the consensus solutions, filling in the gaps, and then having the experience to do it.
As a result of the ongoing COVID pandemic, economic recovery and development, and addressing Seattle's crumbling transit infrastructure, which you hinted on in your previous answer, such as the West Seattle Bridge and the Magnolia Bridge, are of great importance. Additionally, some are expressing concerns that the jobs that left downtown Seattle specifically are permanent and that workers are not going to return. So this is a three-part question. Part one, how do you plan on tackling the infrastructure issue, of which it sounds like you're passionate about? How will you stimulate economic recovery and development as we move beyond COVID? And then the third part, what concern do you have about employers and workers not returning to Seattle?
All right, that's a lot of great questions. And I think what it really recognizes is how important infrastructure is as a tool to spurring economic recovery. And I was the chair of the governor's task force on safe work and economic recovery. And one of our core recommendations was that we need to be making major investments in infrastructure, both the safety fix it first projects like saving our bridges and fixing potholes, but also really saving public transit. In a big, dense city, we need to make sure that people have options to get around, and for those folks who are transit dependent, continue to have that agency and freedom that transit really brings. So that's a really important piece. And I would say that there are really three core strategies that we need to be employing to be able to continue to fund transit and move it into the next generation of really excellent service, and then also fixing our bridges. The great news is that the state is still considering a transportation investment package, and the city has to be advocating for including our bridges and transit infrastructure in that. Secondly, the Biden administration is also considering a significant infrastructure plan. That matters. And then third, we have our own local tools, and we need to be stepping up and being a partner in funding and furthering our own infrastructure. And I would say that it has to be tethered to our core values, though, around equity, making sure that those parts of the city that have historically been left out, particularly those communities of color, have the first set of investments that matters. Secondly, climate change. Transportation is a really significant driver of climate change, so we need to be lowering emissions from transportation. And then again, this idea of freedom and agency. Transportation should be a way to help you get to where you need to go. And our most vulnerable users, our youngest, our oldest, folks with disabilities, we really need to be centering their needs. So that's a little bit about my transportation agenda. There's a lot more on my website. And then, as to that second question, I think it was around downtown and what we're going to do around downtown. Our city is so strong because we have a fantastic downtown and we have great neighborhoods, and we need to be investing in both. And obviously, there are a lot of concerns about the state of downtown right now. And one of the core things that we need to be doing over the long run, they're both short-term and long-run things that we need to be doing. We've done a great job bringing jobs downtown. And of course, now there's some question around what's going to happen in COVID, after the pandemic. But we really need to be being aggressive about continuing to build housing downtown. If you have a family like mine, there aren't a lot of options for you to be able to live downtown. We need to treat downtown like the great neighborhood that it is. And so that means really aligning the housing strategies with the job strategies. And that way you're able to have people downtown shopping and participating in commerce, et cetera. But that also then means you need that complete community aspect. You need schools, you need open space. Those are all longer term things. In the very near term, of course, people are worried about public safety. They're worried about, actually getting people downtown again. They're worried about our jobs going to be coming back. And that is something that we absolutely need to be focusing on. I think one of the things we can be doing is, be a tourist in your own community as a way of getting people back downtown. Downtown is open. And part of it is just that, kind of reculturating ourselves and changing our habits again to being downtown for those of us who don't live downtown and don't go downtown every day again. But obviously, public homelessness and public safety are real concerns, and those need to be addressed immediately as well. I'm not going to go into the details again around homelessness because I did before, but that is something that we absolutely have to address. It is a crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis, and we just haven't been acting like it. And that's something that has really impacted downtown in particular.
As a result of protests related to the murder of George Floyd, police violence, and ongoing racial inequality, Seattle has earned a reputation as crime-ridden, dirty, and unsafe. At one point, the city was labeled an anarchist jurisdiction by the previous presidential administration. Do you agree with that view? What do you think is going to shift perceptions? And how do you address racial inequality that exists in Seattle?
Well, I want to just start by pushing back really hard on the Trump administration. They obviously had a strong political interest in, demeaning cities for a whole host of reasons. So I just want to dismiss that out of hand. But, I will say that there is this sense, I think, across the city that we want to be a city that we're proud of. And how do we turn anger into action? And particularly around public safety. And I just want to talk a little bit about what I see as our city's core values around that, because that should guide our conversations and therefore our strategies and budgets around public safety. So first of all, every single person in our city, especially our Black and Brown community members, should feel safe as they go about their day-to-day lives. And, for people like Charlena Lyles, who was murdered by the police 4 years ago in 2017, she was calling for help. She was in a crisis. So that is a situation and an instance where our public safety failed because it was not creating safety for folks. Likewise, another value that is really important is that public safety has to mean so much more than just a traditional policing response. It has to mean all of those social and economic and cultural supports that create thriving communities. And those ideas need to really drive our discussions around budgets and what public safety means. And so just to do if I could give a couple of specific examples then of what I mean by that, because the details matter here. Our values and articulating our values matter, but the details matter too. So our crisis response system absolutely needs to be changed. There should not be a case where if you are in the midst of a mental or behavioral health issue, you could get harmed or killed by the police. That is absolutely something that we need to change. And there are actually a lot of strategies that are being employed on the ground in Seattle, whether it's Health One that is through the fire department or community-based crisis response systems relying on caseworkers. We need to scale those up. Another specific example where we can do better around public safety is by really changing the way we do transportation and enforcement. Too often, there is a disparate enforcement of traffic laws, whether you're fare enforcement, crossing the street, riding a bike. And we know that there are actually ways to remove an officer from actually the policing piece. You can do all kinds of things to slow traffic down on streets, whether it's use of cameras or creating bulb outs and more street trees. There are lots of ways to promote better safety around transportation that we should be looking at. But there are things that are working that we need to also keep. For example, our regional domestic violence unit and the way they have been working to take guns away from dangerous people. That matters. Implementing our ERPO, our Extreme Risk Protection Order law, that's really important. The detective work that happens around things like theft of catalytic converters. Those are things that we need to continue to invest in. So it has to be tethered, though, to values first, and then strategies and budgets need to follow.
On the subject of, you've dovetailed on a lot of things that we're going to dive deeper into. Compared to the West Coast cities of Portland, San Francisco, San Jose, Sacramento, Oakland, and San Diego, Seattle has the second highest cost per officer, tied with Oakland, and the second highest officer per capita behind San Francisco. Additionally, the average officer makes $150,000 a year before benefits, according to a study done in the Seattle Times and also Forbes. Seattle police say that they are suffering from slow response times and claims that they need additional budget. The police budget was cut approximately 18%, and staffing levels were adjusted to roughly 1,325 officers if fully staffed. They're at 1088 today. How would you define defund the police, and what is your position on defund? And how, as mayor, do you restore community trust in the Seattle Police Department?
So again, this answer has to be driven by what our values are. And I just, articulated them, which is to say that every single person should feel safe as they go about their day-to-day lives, and that public safety is so much more than just a traditional police response. It's those cultural, economic, and social supports that create thriving communities. And fundamentally, our budgets and therefore staffing levels have to reflect those values and the strategies that actually work. And I laid out a bunch of those strategies in my previous answer, so I won't go through them again, but it is just to say that you can't lead the conversation with staffing levels, because in a vacuum, you don't get the results that you want around actual public safety. You have to start with values and the strategies that we know work.
What is your position on defund the police? One of the protester demands in 2020 was defund by 50%. Again, budget was cut by 18%. What is your position, and how do you define defund?
Yeah, so my position is that our public safety system fundamentally needs to be transformed, particularly in those places that are causing deep harm. Our crisis response is an example. Transportation enforcement is another example. The way we treat substance abuse is another example. Those are all things that need deep transformation. And so my position is that if we are able to transform based on our values, if we are able to build budgets and staffing levels based on our values, there will be things that we are scaling up, but there will be things that we are absolutely scaling down. So that is how I would approach this conversation, so that we actually get to outcomes where every single person, particularly our Black and Brown neighbors, feel safe in this community.
One of many things that COVID has shed light on and that you have alluded to is the ongoing mental health crisis that is facing us as a nation. And Seattle is not exempt from this. Recently, a man in the throes of a mental health crisis was fatally wounded by the Seattle Police Department near the Seattle waterfront. Some cities have implemented programs where unarmed teams and social workers respond to mental health calls. And in Seattle, we've rolled out Health One. We're adding a second unit currently, and a third unit, I believe, is proposed. What would you do as mayor to further address the ongoing mental health crisis? And I'm going to add a little bit to that question: the increasing opioid deaths that we are currently seeing in headlines over the last, say, 60 days.
On people experiencing mental health crises, particularly on the street or in their homes and calling for help, we need to be doing those things that we know work. I mentioned Charlene Lyles. She had actually called for help 17 times prior to her being shot and killed by the police. So that is a system that is not working. And we actually do know that there are programs, and you mentioned them, professionals, they are caseworkers, they are social workers who are building relationships with people over time so that they're able to meet their medical and healthcare needs, as well as help them get to services. That is absolutely something we should be doing, and we know that works. For example, Health One is an example, but there are other programs, Just Cares. So we need to be scaling those programs up because they get people connected to the services and the housing they need, and they are typically a safer response, a less fatal or harmful response. So that's really important. On the opioid crisis, we have a comprehensive state opioid response plan, and the city needs to be a much more proactive partner in implementing that plan. And there are a lot of components. There are upstream components, working with doctors around prescriptions using non-medical pain management approaches, working to make sure that people have safe storage, training physicians to be, and medical professionals to be able to assess whether there is an early stage opioid addiction happening, so that help can be remedied or can be provided. So there are a bunch of upstream things that we need to be partnering with our medical and care community to be implementing that are part of our state's plan. And then related to, again, what happens when people are in the throes of addiction, we need to be creating pathways so that people can get the kinds of supports they need, particularly medical opioid use disruptors. There are treatments like Suboxone that require daily administration. So we need to be scaling up our public health infrastructure so that people have access to that, so that they can get to a place where they're able to, have reduced cravings, where they're able to have that interruption of the addiction cycle that we know is necessary for people to really get to a better place. So the public health infrastructure matters. And then, of course, the final piece is that stable housing, because you can't get in front of an addiction if you don't have a stable place to go every night.
On the subject of stable housing affordability is a significant problem in Seattle. 88% of Seattle's land for housing is zoned for single-family units. Over the last 5 years, most of the new construction has been centered on the 12% that supports high-density housing. Developers and builders focused on small footprint properties with minimal parking and luxury appointments. Do you support changing zoning rules for ADUs and more dense construction? That was part one. This is part two. What changes to Seattle regulations for the construction of residential property would you support?
So the affordability crisis is a real consequence of many decades and in part centuries of systemic racism that have really left out particularly our Black neighbors and wealth accumulation that comes from housing, but also trickle-down economics, where we have not adequately regulated and taken away, in fact, regulations that created housing stability in the last couple of decades. So we actually need to take a comprehensive approach. Zoning is one piece of that, and I very much support changing and reforming our zoning so that every neighborhood has access to diversity of housing types that meet people at different income levels and meet people at various stages of their life cycle. Again, if you want to age in place and live in the neighborhood you've lived in for a long time, you may not have opportunities. And so really changing the kinds of the housing diversity within a neighborhood matters. But there are a lot of things that we need to be doing beyond just zoning, because zoning changes in and of itself doesn't create stable communities necessarily or affordable housing in the way we want it to. We need to be looking at those financing mechanisms that run behind or through a building. You may be familiar with a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. That's a great housing product if you're lucky enough to have it, and it creates a lot of stability for a homeowner. We need to be thinking about what is that next generation of stability supports for both owners, people getting into homeowning, and current renters. Those things all really matter, and that's a conversation that's beyond zoning. Finally, obviously, the way we do permitting, that has to be streamlined. It takes way too long in this city. We know that we can reform permitting to achieve both our ability to deliver more housing, our environmental goals. You don't need to pit those two things against each other, such as tree canopy and more affordable housing. Those are things that absolutely can be sorted out. And I know this. I helped negotiate a permit streamlining bill at the state level that had broad support of both the environmental community and the development community. So these are things that we can absolutely do. And we just need to be focused. And again, that's why I'm proposing ST3 for housing, because what gets planned for at least has a chance of getting done.
Seattle has a reputation for having high taxes compared to other Washington cities. A number of initiatives have added incremental taxes to fund transit, homeless programs, education, and the general fund. These taxes are small on paper. For instance, STBD Prop 1 added 1/2 of 1 cent to the city's sales tax. However, most of these taxes are regressive due to Washington state's existing tax structure. Will you pledge no new taxes for the residents of Seattle? And what programs would you cut?
No new tax pledges are the language of trickle-down proponents, which I do not believe in any way. But I will say this is how I approach a tax conversation. First of all, it should be driven by what services do we want to fund. This is a city that cares about high quality services, and this is a city that wants to fund those things. So when we are talking about taxes, we are merely talking about the mechanism that allows us to, through government, provide the things that we want, whether it's transit or childcare or environmental programs or parks. Those are things that people want, and we have to start by start the conversation so that it's really tied to what it is that we're trying to do. Secondly, we do have, now it may be the number two most regressive tax system thanks to action that the state took. So the city now needs to be working as a partner to have access to more tools that are fundamentally progressive and focused on expecting the very wealthiest to be paying their fair share. As you mentioned, the very wealthiest pay only 3% of their overall income into taxes, and for the very lowest income, it's 17%. So the city needs to be a partner in really aggressively changing that. And so that is something that is a value of mine that also animates my opinion around taxes.
What programs would you cut if you were mayor?
That is a question that you have to be looking at in that broad sense of what is it that we are actually trying to do. And, if you are talking about transit, if you are talking about parks programming, if you are talking about funding for homelessness services, I think the broad point is that we are not doing enough. Now, there are things that we need to be looking at, and I named a few, particularly in the public safety conversation. We can be looking at a lot of different ways to do better traffic outcomes, safer traffic outcomes without the use of officers. So that's a place where we need to be looking at as a place to cut. Again, also the idea around crisis response and who we're asking to go at a time of crisis. That's something that we can look at changing. So there are things that we can be doing to change how we're spending money in the city, but it absolutely has to be tied with what are our objectives, what makes a great livable city. And as mayor, I will say, I have been a legislator. I have worked at the executive level in government before, and every single expenditure matters. And you have to go through every single line item with a fine-tooth comb because that is really about delivering services for the city. So I will commit to delivering budgets that have that attention to detail and are really focused on delivering the things that we want in this city.
Jessyn, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it. I know our viewers have appreciated hearing about your platform and your vision for Seattle for 2021 and beyond. We wish you luck in your campaign, and I'm sure we'll be talking again in the future.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me.